Iran 1953, the coup that changed the Middle East. Imagine a country sitting on enormous oil reserves. Now imagine that the oil beneath that country's soil is controlled by a foreign company. The company makes enormous profits. The local workers live in poor conditions. And when the country's government finally decides that its oil should belong to its own people, the foreign powers benefiting from that arrangement decide the government has to go. This sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but it happened. In Iran, in 1953, a British intelligence operation, joined by the CIA, helped overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran's oil industry. The Shah returned to power. Iran's political system was transformed, and the consequences would eventually help shape the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the decades of hostility between Iran and the United States that followed. But to understand why Mossadegh became a target, we have to go back to the beginning. The oil deal. In 1901, a British businessman named William Knox D'Arcy secured a huge oil concession from the Persian government. The agreement gave him extensive rights to search for, extract, and sell oil across a vast area of Persia. At the time, Persia was financially weak and politically vulnerable, but D'Arcy's gamble eventually paid off. After years of unsuccessful exploration, oil was discovered in southwestern Persia in 1908. The following year, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was established. The discovery changed everything. For Britain, Persian oil was becoming a strategic asset, and in 1914, that importance became even greater. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was pushing the British Royal Navy toward oil-powered ships. Oil offered major advantages over coal. Ships could travel farther, refuel more efficiently, and operate with greater speed and flexibility. But Britain had a problem. It did not have enough domestic oil. Persia did. So the British government purchased a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Iranian oil was no longer simply a commercial resource. It had become part of Britain's national strategy. And this created a growing contradiction. Iran possessed the resource, but Britain exercised enormous control over the industry built around it. For Iranian nationalists, that arrangement became increasingly difficult to accept. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as it was later known, became one of the most important institutions in Iran. But it was also a symbol of foreign influence. Iranian workers in the oil fields and refineries often lived in conditions dramatically worse than British employees. In Abadan, home to the company's enormous refinery, British staff lived in comparatively comfortable compounds while many Iranian workers lived in poorer districts with inadequate infrastructure. The financial arrangement was also deeply controversial. The Iranian government had limited ability to inspect the company's books, and Iranian nationalists believed that the country was receiving far too little from a resource that belonged to Iran. The resentment wasn't only about money, it was about dignity and sovereignty. The question was becoming impossible to ignore. Why should foreigners control Iran's most valuable natural resource? Mossadegh. One of the men who had been asking that question for years was Mohammad Mossadegh. Born in 1882 into a prominent Iranian family, Mossadegh studied law in Europe before entering politics. He became a leading constitutional nationalist and one of the most prominent opponents of foreign political influence in Iran. By the late 1940s, the demand for oil nationalization was becoming increasingly powerful. And then another Middle Eastern country changed the political calculation. In 1950, Saudi Arabia reached a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with Aramco. To many Iranians, the comparison was humiliating. If Saudi Arabia could receive half of the profits from its oil, why should Iran continue under a much less favorable arrangement with the British? The pressure for nationalization exploded. Then, on March 7, 1951, Prime Minister Haj Ali Razmara was assassinated by a member of the Fada'iyan Islam. Razmara had opposed immediate nationalization, arguing that Iran did not yet have the technical ability to operate the oil industry independently. His assassination removed one of the most important obstacles to nationalization. On March 15th, the Majlis, Iran's parliament, voted for nationalization. Mossadegh became prime minister in April, and one of his first major acts was to implement the nationalization law. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's operations in Iran were taken over. The National Iranian Oil Company was established. For Mossadegh's supporters, this was a historic moment. Iran was finally taking control of its own oil. But in London, the reaction was very different. Britain saw its economic and strategic interests being threatened, and it was about to fight back. Britain's response. Britain first tried economic pressure. Iranian oil exports were severely restricted. British technicians were withdrawn from the Abadan refinery. The refinery's operations collapsed. Iran's oil production fell dramatically. The country was heavily dependent on oil revenue, so the loss of exports created a major economic crisis. Britain also tried diplomatic and legal pressure. The dispute reached the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. Mossadegh personally traveled abroad to defend Iran's position. But in July 1952, the International Court of Justice ruled that it lacked jurisdiction over the dispute. Legally, Iran had achieved an important victory. Economically, however, the crisis continued. Iran had nationalized its oil, but Britain had made it extremely difficult to sell that oil internationally. And Britain was now considering something far more aggressive: removing Mossadegh himself. British intelligence began developing covert plans to replace his government. But there was a problem. Britain's influence inside Iran had been badly damaged. And in October 1952, Mossadegh's government broke diplomatic relations with Britain and expelled British diplomats. Britain could no longer operate as freely inside Iran, so it needed another partner. It turned to Washington. Why did the United States agree? At first, the United States was reluctant. President Harry Truman's administration generally preferred negotiation. American officials did not simply view Mossadegh as a communist. But the Cold War was intensifying. Iran bordered the Soviet Union, and Iran had a powerful communist party, the Tudeh Party. The British understood exactly how to frame the Iranian crisis for the Americans. Instead of presenting the problem simply as a dispute over British oil interests, they emphasized the possibility that instability in Iran could benefit the Soviet Union. When Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953, the political environment in Washington changed. His administration was more receptive to covert action. The Dulles brothers were particularly important. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. His brother, Allen Dulles, was director of the CIA. The administration viewed international politics through a strongly anti-communist lens. And Iran suddenly looked like a potential Cold War crisis. But there is an important detail often lost in simplified versions of this story. American intelligence did not necessarily believe that Mossadegh himself was a communist puppet or that a Soviet takeover was inevitable. The CIA's own assessments recognized that the situation was more complicated. Nevertheless, American policymakers eventually decided that Mossadegh had to be removed. The CIA and British intelligence began working together. The Americans called their Operation Ajax, better known as Operation Ajax. The British referred to their plan as Operation Boot. And the man chosen to help run the operation inside Iran was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a senior CIA officer. The coup plan. The objective was not simply to send troops into Tehran. The plan was political warfare. CIA documents later described the goal as bringing down Mossadegh's government and replacing it with a pro-Western government under the Shah, with General Fazlollah Zahedi as Prime Minister. The operation involved several components. Political factions opposed to Mossadegh were cultivated. Newspaper campaigns were encouraged. Propaganda was used to attack Mossadegh's reputation. Money was distributed through networks of politicians and other influential groups. And the military was brought into the plan. But there was one person whose cooperation was essential. The Shah. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was still Iran's monarch. The coup planners wanted him to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing Zahedi. The Shah was terrified. If the coup failed, he could lose his throne. He hesitated. But eventually, under pressure from the British and Americans, he signed the decrees. The first attempt was launched. And it failed. August 15th. On the night of August 15th, 1953, forces loyal to the coup attempted to arrest Mossadegh. But Mossadegh had been warned. The officers sent to arrest him were detained instead. The operation collapsed. The Shah panicked. He fled Iran, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. For the moment, it looked like Mossadegh had survived. The coup appeared to be over, and the CIA station received instructions to abandon the operation. But Kermit Roosevelt did not leave. He decided to continue. Over the next few days, the coup network was reorganized. Political contacts were activated. Opposition to Mossadegh was encouraged. The situation inside Tehran became increasingly unstable. And then came August 19th. August 19th, 1953. Crowds began appearing in the streets of Tehran. Some participants were genuinely opposed to Mossadegh. Others were mobilized through networks connected to the coup operation. The CIA had provided covert financial support for political activity and demonstrations. The demonstrations grew. At the same time, military units began moving against important government facilities. Radio stations were seized. Key roads and installations were occupied. The army moved through Tehran. Mossadegh's supporters resisted. Fighting spread through the capital. Eventually, forces supporting Zahedi gained control. Mossadegh's government collapsed. He escaped from his residence, but surrendered the following day. The coup had succeeded. The Shah returned to Iran, and the political system of the country had been fundamentally altered. The CIA's own later documentation confirms that the operation had been designed to remove Mossadegh and establish a pro-Western government under the Shah. This was not merely a spontaneous uprising. It was a coup in which foreign intelligence agencies played a decisive role alongside Iranian political and military actors. What happened to Mossadegh? Mossadegh was arrested and put on trial. He was initially sentenced to death. The Shah later commuted the sentence. Mossadegh spent years under restrictions and eventually lived under house arrest. He died in 1967. He never returned to political life. But his removal solved only one problem for Britain and America. The larger question remained: what would happen to Iran's oil? The 1954 Oil Consortium. In 1954, a new international consortium was created to manage Iran's oil exports. British Petroleum, successor to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, received 40%. 5 American companies collectively received another 40%. Royal Dutch Shell received 14%. A French company received 6%. Iran retained its national Iranian Oil Company, but the new consortium restored Western companies to a dominant role in the country's oil industry. The balance had changed. Before the coup, British interests had dominated Iranian oil. After the coup, American companies gained a major position as well. The oil was flowing again. But Iran had entered a new political era. The Shah's Iran. The Shah's position was now far stronger. His government increasingly suppressed political opposition. In 1957, Iran established SAVAK, its intelligence and internal security organization, with assistance from the United States and Israel. SAVAK became notorious for surveillance, censorship, arrests, and torture. But the Shah's rule was not simply a story of repression. Iran also underwent major modernization. Oil revenues increased. The government invested in roads, education, infrastructure, industry, and the military. During the 1960s, the Shah launched the White Revolution, a major program of social and economic reform. Iran was changing rapidly, but modernization came with enormous political and social tensions. Traditional communities were disrupted. Economic inequality remained. Corruption became a growing problem, and political opposition was tightly restricted. The Shah had created a powerful modernizing state, but he had also created a political system with very little room for dissent. And underneath that system was a memory that never disappeared. The memory of the coup. For many Iranians, the story was simple. They had tried to take control of their country's oil. A government led by Mossadegh had nationalized the industry. Britain and the United States had intervened. Mossadegh had been removed. The Shah had returned. And Western influence had been restored. That memory became increasingly important as opposition to the Shah grew. By the 1970s, Iran was experiencing rapid economic and social change. Oil revenues were enormous. The Shah spent heavily on modernization and military power. But wealth was unevenly distributed. Political repression continued. And the gap between the modernizing state and large parts of Iranian society was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Then the pressure exploded. The 1979 revolution. By 1978, protests against the Shah had spread across Iran. The opposition was incredibly diverse. Secular nationalists, leftists, students, religious conservatives, merchants, intellectuals. They did not agree on what Iran should become, but they increasingly agreed that the Shah had to leave. In January 1979, the Shah left Iran. Weeks later, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile. The monarchy collapsed. The Islamic Revolution succeeded. And one of the historical grievances repeatedly invoked by the revolutionaries was foreign intervention, especially 1953. Then came another event that would define U.S.-Iranian relations: the hostage crisis. In October 1979, the United States allowed the former Shah to enter the country for medical treatment. Many Iranian revolutionaries feared that the United States might once again intervene in Iranian politics. After all, they remembered what had happened in 1953. On November 4th, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. 52 Americans were taken hostage. They would remain captive for 444 days. The hostage crisis destroyed the already collapsing relationship between Washington and Tehran, and the revolutionaries explicitly connected their actions to the history of American involvement in Iran. To them, the embassy was not simply a diplomatic building. It represented the country that had helped overthrow Mossadegh. The memory of 1953 had become part of the political identity of the new Islamic Republic. Did America ever admit it? For decades, much of the operation remained classified. But eventually, the American government began acknowledging its role. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged that the United States had played a significant role in the overthrow of Mossadegh and described the policy as regrettably short-sighted. In 2009, President Barack Obama referred to the 1953 overthrow in his Cairo speech, acknowledging that the United States had played a role in overthrowing Iran's democratically elected government. And later declassified documents provided even more detail. The CIA's historical record now confirms the basic structure of the operation. The objective was to remove Mossadegh. The Shah was to be strengthened. Zahedi was to become prime minister. Political factions were organized against Mossadegh, and covert financial support was used to help build opposition to his government. In 2023, the CIA itself publicly acknowledged that the 1953 coup it supported was undemocratic. The historical record is therefore no longer based solely on Iranian accusations or later political interpretations. The United States' own documents provide evidence of its role. Was the coup only about oil? This is where the story becomes more complicated. It would be tempting to say that Britain wanted its oil, and therefore America overthrew Mossadegh. Oil was unquestionably central. Britain had enormous economic and strategic interests in Iranian petroleum. The nationalization of the oil industry threatened those interests directly. But the American motivation was more complicated. The Cold War mattered. The Soviet Union mattered. The Tudeh Party mattered. Iran's internal political divisions mattered. And American policymakers genuinely feared that prolonged instability could create an opening for communist influence. So the coup was not simply about one thing. It was a collision between oil, nationalism, imperial interests, Cold War strategy, Iranian political conflict, and the struggle over who would control Iran's future. That is what makes 1953 so important. Because removing Mossadegh did not remove the underlying problems. It simply changed the people controlling them. The consequences. In the short term, the coup was a success for Britain and the United States. The Shah was restored. Iran remained aligned with the West. The oil industry returned to international production. And the immediate fear of Soviet influence appeared to have been contained. But the long-term consequences were very different. The Shah became increasingly authoritarian. Political opposition was suppressed. Savak became feared. And millions of Iranians continued to remember that a foreign-backed operation had removed a nationalist prime minister. The CIA had achieved regime change. But regime change was not the same thing as stability. 26 years later, the Shah was gone. The monarchy was gone. And Iran had become an Islamic republic deeply hostile toward the United States. The hostage crisis followed. Then decades of sanctions, military confrontations, proxy conflicts, and disputes over Iran's nuclear program. It would be an oversimplification to say that all of these events were caused by the 1953 coup. They weren't. Iranian politics had many causes. The revolution had many causes. But 1953 was one of the most important turning points. The real legacy. The story of Iran in 1953 is ultimately not just about oil. It is about sovereignty. It is about foreign intervention. It is about the Cold War. And it is about what happens when powerful countries decide that another country's political choices threaten their strategic interests. Mossadegh believed Iran should control its own oil. Britain believed its economic and strategic position was being threatened. American leaders increasingly saw Iran through the lens of the Cold War. Iranian political factions fought over the country's future, and foreign intelligence agencies entered that struggle. The result was the overthrow of Mossadegh. But the consequences lasted far longer than the coup itself. The Shah remained in power for another 26 years. Western influence returned. Iran modernized rapidly. But political opposition was increasingly suppressed, and resentment toward foreign intervention never disappeared. When the Shah finally fell in 1979, the memory of 1953 was still there. It helped shape how the new Islamic Republic viewed the United States. And that relationship has remained hostile for generations. So when we look at Iran and America today, at sanctions, nuclear negotiations, proxy conflicts, military confrontations, and decades of mistrust, The story does not begin in 1979. It begins much earlier, with an oil concession, with a struggle over national sovereignty, with a prime minister who believed Iran should control its own resources, and with a covert operation that removed him from power. The coup lasted days. The Shah's rule lasted decades. But the consequences of those few days in August 1953 have lasted much longer. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the entire story. A government can be overthrown in a matter of days. But the consequences of overthrowing it can shape a country for generations.